even state it like this. Obviously, BlackRock is a very large organization. Does it have a? And I'm just picking on BlackRock. You go all three, whichever one. Does it have a goal? Like, is there a goal here, or is this just a bunch of goals that are manifesting in perverse outcomes? Like, what do you think, if there is a goal of BlackRock? What is it?
I love where you're going here, and I'm going to go two different directions with it. And first, the goal of BlackRock, it's hard to say. Larry Fink is very good at his job, extremely good at his job. And Vanguard is notoriously good at obfuscating who's actually calling the shots there. As in, they say that like the funds own and so anyways, it's like, it is hard to get a concrete answer as to like, is this intentional? Mm-hmm. And the best you can do is sort of look at what they're doing across the world, like what they're doing in Ukraine to fund and so, make your own judgments. But I think the more interesting part of your question is, although I might back up for a second and say, even if BlackRock doesn't have a goal, I can't imagine that the financial institutions and the members of the big club that you're not in have any problem with this voting rights thing that I just described. Like, regardless of whether it's intentional or not, the outcome benefits them all. So they're all incentivized to keep that going. Of course, yeah. But I think the really interesting part of this is sort of back to this, is there this shadowy cabal of guys sitting around the table deciding how the world runs? Or is it, what's the phrase that you...
Meta fraud.
Meta fraud. That's so good. I'm going to remember that. And I like to take it out of the place where we're like being contentious about it. Like, no, there's no cabal controlling the world today. It's like, whatever. I don't care. Yeah. Let's rewind somewhere in history where we have a little more clarity and unpack it as an example. And the Iraq War is a perfect example. Dick Cheney, as our vice president, as, a representative of Halliburton, as an author of not exactly an author, but as a member of PNAC and a key architect of the Iraq War, we know full well at this point that several of the people deep in the Bush administration very much knew that the intelligence on WMDs were absolute outright lies at the time that they were being pitched to us. We knew that. We know it now. At the time, we were being fooled. And we know that some of those really high-level people knew that they were for sure lies. But George Bush might have just been dumb enough to get used by his buddies that were way more savvy than him. Like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney had been around since George Bush Sr. And George Bush Sr. was a full-on CIA operative. And there's a whole other rabbit hole about him doing like these secret dark things in the Vietnam era before he became the CIA director. That is a whole other rabbit. So his daddy, HW, was good at his job. And Rumsfeld and Cheney were around back in that day, and they're the old hats. And it's hard not to see them getting appointed as W's handlers. And so when you look at W, it's like maybe he knew how fraudulent they were being, but maybe he was just a useful idiot. And then you move down the chain and you think about all the journalists that parroted those lines. It's like, did they really know what they were doing, or were they just manipulable? And when you create narratives that are believable enough and that are palatable enough and that have the ability to be sold as like either the greater good or for America or for the safety of civilians or democracy, those kinds of things are things that you can rally, sorry guys, the useful idiots around. I'm just talking about Iraq War. I'm not talking about right now. But that's where you start to realize, like, I think that people often like want that simple answer of there's like 12 families that rule the world, and like maybe, but I don't really care either way, because the more you kind of like look down the line at the people that are actually engaging in the fraud in our media spaces, in our political spaces, our financial spaces, some of them know what they're doing, but not all of them. And some people are smart enough to conspire to do great things for good or for evil, like, because that's just how humans collaborate to do things. Like, if you want to start a cool podcast, you got to work with some cool people to make a podcast happen. And if you want to, make a giant financial bubble based on fraudulent housing market and then pop it and, run off with a whole bailout, you got to get with some pretty great people in order to do it. And it wouldn't hurt for that to be like the guys that run the Fed and run the banks and run the government, and then bring in a president that is willing to put all of your guys into his cabinet, which is a whole other rabbit hole. So I love unpacking that layer of like, No, I don't personally think that it is like a table of people deciding the fate of the world.
Yeah.
I think there are tables of people that are exerting massive amounts of influence to their interests, and identifying those tables, so to speak, those metaphorical tables of powerful interests, like the Federal Reserve System, like the sort of defense contractor international war machine system, the big pharma lobbies. Identifying those really helps you clear up the media space and the information space to understand better what's going on.
Yeah, it goes back to something you said way earlier, right? Like looking to see who is invested in which outcome, right? Which is maybe another way of saying follow the money, right? Exactly. It's like it just, because ultimately, I mean, not that people always do what's in their financial best interest, but generally, right? If you have to paint it in the broadest strokes, like that's a pretty reliable, I mean, not as reliable as maybe, gravity, but damn, it's pretty close, right? Like broad strokes, if you have to guess what someone's going to do, well, it's Darwinian, right? They're acting in a way that optimizes their self-preservation, right? So, yeah, it seems like a very useful way a useful lens, let's say, to look at the world through.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to, understand these stories that are fed to us. Because, you brought up the Iraq War. It's a great one. It's like, they have weapons of mass destruction. Here's 10,000 pages of reports that verify that. It's like you can't even get through this information. And then the information, it's like, you talk about tracing it to source. It's like a lot of it's redacted. And it's like you're just... I don't know. It's a fool's errand. You'll just never get to the bottom of that.
And it's designed to be one.
And it's designed because it's a distraction, right? But if you just look like, wait, who's getting paid here? Right? Like, why is this 100%. Even called the Iraq War? First of all, it's like it's not even a war. We're just invading a country.
Had nothing to do with 9/11.
No, had nothing to do with that.
No. Well, they tried to make it have something to do with 9/11 by creating this anthrax scare and sending out a whole bunch of anthrax to conveniently all the people that were opposed to the Iraq War, plus some fake anthrax to the other ones to throw off the trail. And then that anthrax traced back to a CIA lab as the only place it could be produced when we actually got the facts later on. So I think that it blows my mind how many journalists on Twitter today have such a short memory to be able to kind of generally we all agree that is what happened during the Iraq War. And then to see what happened in Ukraine and not ask any questions, to see what's happened with Israel and Gaza and not ask very many questions, and to see what's about to happen with Iran and not ask too many questions. And it just blows my mind. Like I have yet to find a war that was not started by political scheming and fake news, essentially, dating all the way back to like kind of World War II, but kind of beyond that, even like kind of World War I. Maybe beyond that, it's real hard to do.
Yeah, I mean,
all wars are bankers' wars.
Yeah, and I was going to go to Sun Tzu. He said all warfare is based on deception, right? So it's like, of course, these are all
100%.
The amount of lies we've been told. It's unreal. What is something that you've learned? Well, obviously, you've done a lot of learning, and the journey you've been on.
Right now.
What is something that, I don't know, maybe has surprised you or something that's been especially impactful that's changed your view of the world? Like maybe specifically how an economy works. Like what are some of the revelations you have had over the past 14 months of doing this?
This one is that's a particularly like difficult question to answer when I first think about it. And it's because the more I hone in on that answer, it is not really a monetary answer. Because I thought going into this, I was trying to figure out how money works and how the economy works and all that. And there is all this fascinating stuff to learn about how corrupt it is and how interesting. But I think the thing that is most startling to me is how involved covert intelligence agencies are in the financial systems. And not just directly in the financial systems, but indirectly as well. And that's, I mean, I've already talked about it at length, but that's why I talk about it so much, because I don't think that anyone realizes, for good reason, just how powerful and involved the various arms of those agencies are. Because, and if you just look at Jeffrey Epstein's network as the one prime example, everyone knows about his trafficking operation, and the buck kind of stops there. But they don't realize that before being a human trafficker, he was an arms dealer. And as an arms dealer, you're dealing with the black market sale of arms, but you're also dealing with all kinds of money laundering, because every single sale has money on the other side. And anytime you're doing, and so obviously his trafficking network has all sorts of money laundering going on as well. And there's a whole concept to talk about. He wasn't involved in drugs, but drugs are one of the other obvious ones there, and all of that black market operation, which is basically the bread and butter of intelligence agencies, is their dark secret. That all involves this whole shadow banking economy that interfaces directly with the mainstream banking economy, and then it interfaces directly with politicians that are sort of in many ways incentivized to keep those flows open, because the black market is critical to the functioning of our, the front of our markets as well. And so in starting to unpack just how incentivized the intelligence agencies are to have a large amount of influence in our financial system, it really started to open my eyes to like how gray the line is between the front and the back of house of our mainstream financial institutions. And one obvious example that I come back to over and over again is one that was in front of all of our faces. Is there were many articles published. Most of us saw a certain form of the article that said Jeffrey Epstein referred a whole bunch of wealthy clientele to JP Morgan, and that was why JP Morgan had this kind of lawsuit going on, and Jamie Dimon had to prove that he didn't really know about it. And that we kind of glossed over the fact that that article just said that Bill Gates and Sergey Brin and all these other billionaires needed a referral to open a bank account at JP Morgan. Like, you can just walk into the front door and ask to open a bank account, right? Everyone knows how to open a bank account at JP Morgan. So what does a billionaire need a referral to JP Morgan to do? Well, what is Jeffrey Epstein good at doing? And the answer is laundering money, right? And if that's still not